They thought they could take everything from him: his land, his dignity, his history. The powerful HOA saw Quiet Black Man's Lake not as heritage, but as profit, building cabin after cabin as if his legacy meant nothing. For years, he watched in silence, while greed swallowed what was rightfully his. But silence has a breaking point, and when he finally acted, the ground trembled, the waters roared, and nature itself seemed to choose a side. What happens when a man pushed to the edge decides to fight back?
Before the cabins, before the HOA, there was just the lake and him. It wasn't just water, it was memory, legacy, and life. Generations of his family had fished its waters, picnicked on its banks, and told stories under the stars. This lake wasn't a property to him, it was a piece of his soul. He lived simply, in a modest wooden cabin tucked beneath tall pines, where mornings began with the sound of birds and evenings ended with the ripple of moonlight on water. Neighbors knew him as quiet, hard-working, and deeply tied to the land. He kept to himself, but everyone could see the pride in his eyes whenever he looked at the lake. For him, it wasn't about wealth, it was about belonging. This was the one place he didn't have to explain himself, the one space where history felt safe in his hands. But in the eyes of those with power, heritage meant nothing. To them, the lake was opportunity, prime real estate, untouched profit waiting to be claimed. The first surveyors arrived with clipboards and sharp suits. Then came the paperwork, stamped with authority, dripping with entitlement. He watched as fences went up, trees were cleared, and the outlines of cabins began to scar the shoreline. One by one, his memories were bulldozed to make way for someone else's vacation dream. At first, he thought he could endure it, that maybe, somehow, they would respect the land's limits. But greed rarely knows restraint, and soon, the life he once knew was shrinking, drowning beneath a tide of arrogance and concrete. The storm was coming. He could feel it in the air. The lake that once echoed with the laughter of his childhood now echoed with the buzz of chainsaws and the hammering of nails. What was sacred to him became a construction site, crawling with trucks, machinery, and workers who didn't see a man guarding his heritage, only an obstacle standing in the way of progress. The HOA's plans were ambitious. 139 luxury cabins, each marketed as Lakeside Paradise. Glossy brochures promised families a perfect escape, but none of them spoke of the man who had called this lake home for generations. To the HOA, he wasn't a rightful owner, he was an inconvenience they thought would quietly fade into the background. At first, he tried to fight with dignity. Letters were written, appeals were filed, meetings were attended. But each time he was dismissed, silenced, or patronized. They spoke over him, questioning his claim, treating him as if his history held no weight against their signatures and money. He wasn't just being ignored, he was being erased. As cabins multiplied along the shore, strangers strolled across his land as if it had always belonged to them. They set up grills, lit bonfires, and launched boats into waters his family had once protected. When he protested, he was met with cold stares and sharp words. "It's not yours anymore." The message was clear. This was no longer his world, and he was expected to disappear. But he did not disappear. He watched, he remembered, and deep inside, something was building. An anger sharper than any axe, heavier than any stone. He began to notice the arrogance of their design. The cabins stood too close to the waterline, their foundations shallow, their walls unprepared for the forces of nature. They thought the lake was tamed, but he knew better. He knew the dam and the power it held.
For years it had kept the waters in check, a silent guardian holding nature at bay. Few remembered that he still had access, still had the knowledge of every bolt, every lever, every hidden pressure that kept the flood contained. And as he stood on the shoreline, listening to the laughter of vacationers echo across water that once belonged to him, one thought grew louder in his mind. What if nature was set free? The injustice had reached its peak. The man who had once lived peacefully now faced a choice: either endure the slow death of his heritage or unleash a force that could never be silenced. And with every passing day, with every cabin rising higher, the answer became clearer. The lake was restless, and so was he.
The day he chose to act began like any other. The cabins were alive with noise, children splashing in the water, barbecues sizzling, laughter echoing across the lake. To the visitors, this was paradise. To him, it was desecration. And as he walked toward the old dam, his footsteps steady, his resolve unshakable, he knew there would be no turning back. The dam loomed before him, a weathered giant of steel and stone, holding back a force few could comprehend. He had maintained it for years, understood its heart like a living thing, and now, with hands that trembled not from fear but from conviction, he reached for the valve. With a deep groan, the mechanism began to turn. At first, just a whisper of water escaped, a trickle sliding down the rocks. Then a roar. The ground quivered under his feet as torrents burst forth, raging like a beast long kept in chains. The calm lake's surface shattered into chaos, waves rolling toward the shore with merciless speed. Cabins shuddered, decks splintered, and the laughter of moments ago turned to screams. People scrambled, slipping in mud, dragging belongings, their paradise dissolving in a flood of panic. The HOA, once so powerful, now stood helpless, their voices drowned beneath the roar of water and the fury of a man who had been ignored for too long. He didn't smile, he didn't cheer, he simply stood, soaked in mist and thunder, watching nature reclaim what had always been hers. The cabins were nothing against the surge, fragile dreams collapsing into broken wood and swirling debris. And as the waters rose higher, swallowing the greed that had stolen his peace, a single truth echoed in his mind. Justice sometimes speaks not in words, but in storms. But as the flood carried everything away, one question remained. What price would he pay for unleashing it?
When the waters finally calmed, the lake was no longer a playground for vacationers. The cabins that had once stood as symbols of greed and entitlement lay shattered, broken timbers floating where laughter once echoed. Nature had reclaimed its own, and with it, the man had reclaimed a piece of his dignity. But the victory was not without cost. The HOA branded him a criminal, blaming him for destruction they themselves had provoked. Headlines painted him as reckless, a danger, a man who had gone too far. Few spoke of the years of erasure, the stolen legacy, the weight of being unheard. In their eyes, his act of defiance was unforgivable, but in his heart, it was inevitable. He stood at the water's edge, watching the ripples carry away the last fragments of what had been forced upon him. There was sorrow, yes, but also a quiet strength. For the first time in years, the lake breathed freely. And though the world might never fully understand his choice, the truth remained: He had reminded them that the oppressed can only be silenced for so long before history answers back. This story is more than one man and one lake. It is a reflection of countless injustices where power erases heritage, where black voices are dismissed, where history is buried beneath profit. It asks a question we cannot ignore. How long must people endure before they are pushed to the breaking point? Perhaps the real flood is not the water that swept away those cabins, but the rising tide of voices demanding justice. And the question left for us is this: will we listen before it's too late?